On September 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler launched a retaliatory campaign against Poland following a false accusation that Poles had attacked German radio offices. This event marked the beginning of World War II, a conflict that would plunge the world into one of the darkest periods in modern history. Caught between two fronts, Poland was simultaneously invaded by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the latter acting in compliance with the Non-Aggression Pact signed between the two powers. On September 28th, Warsaw surrendered, and the next day, Germany and the USSR divided up Polish territory, beginning a brutal and systematic occupation. Welcome to the Soldier's Diary. Painful execution of Wanda Klaff. The Nazi invasion of Poland was not only a territorial conquest, but also a campaign of racial extermination. The Nazis regarded Poles, especially the nobility, clergy, and intellectuals, as racially inferior. German SS, police, and military units arrived with specific orders to eliminate thousands of Poles. In addition, approximately 1.8 million Polish Jews were confined to ghettos, and after the invasion of the Soviet-controlled part of Poland, more than 3 million Jews were deported to concentration camps. One of these camps was Stutthof, located 35 kilometers east of Danzig, present-day Gdansk, where one of the darkest stories of the war would unfold. Danzig, a predominantly German city, had been designated a free city under the protection of the League of Nations following the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. This treaty, which imposed harsh sanctions on Germany, was seen as a humiliation by the German people, especially due to the loss of territories such as West Prussia. When Hitler came to power in 1933, one of his main goals was to reverse the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. In Danzig, the Nazi Party became the dominant political force in 1933, which intensified Germanization and segregation policies against the Polish and Jewish populations. Repressive measures in Danzig included a ban on renting space to Polish schools and the obligation to send Polish children to German schools. In addition, employees of Polish origin were dismissed, and the use of the Polish language in public spaces was restricted. Following Kristallnacht in 1938, Nuremberg's racial laws were tightened, leading to mass emigration of Jews. By 1939, only 1,600 Jews remained in the city, and in 1941 the last 600 were deported to Poland. This context of repression and violence laid the groundwork for the establishment of the Stutthof concentration camp, which would become a symbol of Nazi terror. The Stutthof concentration camp, established in September 1939, was one of the first camps established by the Nazis outside Germany. Originally conceived as a civilian internment camp, its initial purpose was to eliminate the Polish elite, including intellectuals, religious leaders, and politicians. The Nazi authorities had already drawn up lists of people to be detained even before the war, and Stutthof was one of the places selected to carry out this ethnic cleansing. At its beginning, the camp consisted of 8 barracks surrounded by barbed wire fences built by the prisoners themselves. In November 1941, Stutthof was converted into a labor re-education camp for political prisoners and people accused of indiscipline under the management of the SD, German security police. However, in January 1942, the camp came under the jurisdiction of the SS and was transformed into a regular concentration camp. By 1943, the camp was significantly expanded, with the construction of 30 additional barracks, electrified barbed wire, a crematorium, and a gas chamber. This expansion was part of the Nazi plan to implement the final solution, the systematic extermination of European Jews. Conditions at Stutthof were brutal. Prisoners, primarily non-Jewish Poles in their early years, suffered from starvation, disease, and forced labor. Typhus epidemics ravaged the camp in the winters of 1942 and 1944, claiming thousands of lives. Those deemed too weak or sick to work were gassed with Zyklon B, a method of extermination that began to be used in June 1944. It is estimated that up to 4,000 inmates, including women and children, were killed in this manner. In addition, camp doctors performed euthanasia by lethal injections of phenol on sick or wounded prisoners. In 1944, Stutthof received a large number of Jewish prisoners, many of them transferred from Auschwitz. In total, 23,566 Jews, including 21,817 women, were deported to Stutthof. The camp also had a network of sub-camps, such as the Bromberg Ost Female Prisoner Center, where conditions were equally inhumane. The camp was staffed by SS guards and, after 1943, Ukrainian auxiliaries. Among these guards was Wanda Klaff, one of the most feared figures in the camp. Wanda Klaff, born on the 6th of March 1922 in Danzig, was one of the most infamous guards at the Stutthof concentration camp. Coming from a family of German origin, Klaff grew up in an environment marked by resentment towards the Treaty of Versailles and the rise of Nazism in Danzig. After finishing school in 1938, she worked in a jam factory until 1942, when she married and became a housewife. However, in 1944, her life took a dark turn when she was recruited as a guard at the Proust subcamp, and later at Rossoschin, both dependent on Stutthof. Klaff quickly gained a reputation for sadism and brutality. Survivors' testimonies report that she would beat and kick prisoners for no apparent reason, often leaving them unconscious or dead. She would sometimes drown inmates in mud or beat them to death when she was in a bad mood. Her behavior was so extreme that even among SS guards, Klaff stood out for her cruelty. She herself stated during her trial, "I beat at least 2 prisoners every day." The evacuation of Stutthof began in January 1945 as Soviet forces approached the camp. Thousands of prisoners were forced to march in extreme winter conditions in what became known as the Death Marches. Klaff managed to escape from the camp in early 1945, but was arrested in June of that year at her parents' home. Ill with typhoid fever, she was tried at the first Stutthof trial, which began on 25 April 1946. During her trial, Klaff showed no remorse. She boasted of her intelligence and dedication to work in the camps, claiming that her brutality was part of her duty. Death by hanging, a sentence that was carried out publicly on 4th July of that year. The public execution of Wanda Klaff and 10 other Nazi war criminals on July 4, 1946, was an event of great symbolism in post-war Poland. Held on Wzgórze Wieselkauf Hill, Hanging Man's Hill near Danzig, the execution attracted a crowd estimated at 200,000 people. 3 days earlier, newspapers had announced the date, and many companies gave their workers the day off so they could attend. The anticipation was such that security forces had difficulty controlling the crowd, fearing a lynching. The execution was carefully planned to maximize its impact. The condemned, 6 men and 5 women, were transported by truck to the place of execution. Each had their hands and legs bound and were forced to stand on platforms mounted beneath the gallows. Former Stutthof prisoners, dressed in their striped uniforms, acted as executioners. Klaff, aged 24, was hanged by a woman, a detail which added an additional element of symbolism to her execution. The method of hanging used was designed to prolong the suffering of the condemned. The ropes did not break the neck, resulting in a slow death by strangulation. Each execution lasted between 10 and 20 minutes, and the bodies remained hanging in front of the crowd. Klaff was the 4th to be executed, and her death was greeted with cheers from the mourners. After the executions, the crowd climbed onto the gallows to tear buttons and pieces of cloth from the corpses, which were taken to the Danzig Medical University for use in anatomy classes. This macabre end reflected the Polish authorities' desire that the crimes of the Nazis would never be forgotten. Wanda Klaff's execution was not only an act of justice, but also a warning to future generations about the consequences of hatred and inhumanity. Execution of German General Arthur Nebe by hanging with piano wire. July 20th, 1944, is a date that resonates in the history of World War II as a pivotal moment when a group of German military officers attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler at his headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in Rastenburg, East Prussia. This plot, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, sought not only to eliminate the Führer, but also to spark a revolt that would overthrow the National Socialist regime. However, the attempt failed and Hitler survived with only minor injuries. This event was not an isolated act, but the culmination of the efforts of several resistance groups within Germany who, while opposed to Hitler, were deeply implicated in the crimes of the regime, including the Holocaust. One of the most notable conspirators was Arthur Nebe, head of Nazi Germany's criminal police. Nebe, born on November 13, 1894 in Berlin, began his career as a volunteer in World War I, where he was wounded twice. After the war, he joined the Berlin criminal police, known as Kripo, and quickly rose through the ranks. In 1931, he joined the Nazi Party and the SA, Sturmabteilung, the Nazi paramilitary force. With Hitler's rise to power in 1933, Nebe became a key figure in the regime's repressive machinery. In 1935, Nebe was appointed head of the Prussian criminal police, and in 1936, he assumed control of the Kripo at the national level. His rise continued when he was transferred to the SS, where he rose to the rank of SS Sturmbannführer. During this period, Nebe was actively involved in planning and executing racial and security policies that led to the persecution and extermination of Jews, Roma, people with disabilities, and other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Nebe was not a mere bureaucrat. He was an ideologue committed to the Nazi racial vision. In 1939, as head of the Kripo, he was involved in discussions regarding the campaigns against the Sinti and Roma peoples. He proposed sending Berlin's Sinti and Roma to reservations planned for Jews and others in the east. This proposal was part of a larger plan for the relocation and eventual extermination of these communities. The Second World War, which began on the 1st of September 1939 with the invasion of Poland, provided the context for the implementation of these genocidal policies. Arthur Nebe's role in Nazi war crimes intensified with the onset of World War II. In 1939, following the invasion of Poland, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler ordered the creation of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, which included the Kripo under Nebe's command. The Kripo's mission was to exterminate criminality, which in practice meant the pursuit and elimination of groups deemed a threat to the Nazi state. In June 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa, Nebe volunteered to lead Einsatzgruppe B, one of the SS's mobile death squads. These groups were tasked with exterminating Jews, communists, Roma, and other undesirables in conquered territories. Under Nebe's command, Einsatzgruppe B carried out systematic massacres in Belarus and other regions. In a report dated 13 July 1941, Nebe stated that 1,050 Jews had been murdered in Minsk and that the liquidation of Jewish inmates was underway in Vilna, where 500 were shot daily. However, Nebe soon realized that mass shootings were unsustainable both logistically and psychologically. In August 1941, following a visit to Minsk, Himmler expressed concern about the psychological impact that the shootings had on the SS men. Nebe, seeking a more efficient solution, proposed the use of automobile exhaust fumes as a method of extermination. This method, initially tested on psychiatric patients, paved the way for the development of the gas vans used in the Holocaust. Nebe's experiments with exhaust gases were brutal and merciless. In Mogilev, Belarus, Nebe and his team used exhaust hoses to kill psychiatric patients in a sealed room. The process took approximately 15 minutes, and Nebe concluded that this method was more practical than shootings. These tests were the direct precursor to the gas chambers used in extermination camps such as Auschwitz and Treblinka. In addition to his involvement with shootings and gas vans, Arthur Nebe also used hanging as a method of execution to instill terror among the local population. In a report dated 9 October 1941, Nebe described how, following suspicions of partisan activity near Demidov in western Russia, all male residents aged 15 to 55 were rounded up. 17 people were identified as partisans and communists, and 5 of them were publicly hanged in front of 400 local residents. This act of brutality was not only intended to punish the alleged insurgents, but also to send a clear message to the population. Any resistance to the Nazi regime would be punished by death. Hanging became a particularly feared method of execution during World War II, not only because of its brutality, but also because of its public nature. The Nazis used these executions as a form of terror propaganda, ensuring that news of the deaths spread quickly among the population. In the case of Nebe, these executions were part of a broader strategy to maintain control over occupied territories and suppress any form of resistance. The method of hanging used by the Nazis was particularly cruel. Instead of a quick drop that would break the neck, the condemned were hung by a thin rope, causing a slow, agonizing death. In some cases, death could take up to 20 minutes, making this one of the most feared methods of the war. This type of execution not only served to punish the condemned, but also to instill fear in the local population and deter any attempts at resistance. As the war progressed and Germany began to lose ground, Arthur Nebe's position became increasingly precarious. Following the failed assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20, 1944, Nebe, who had taken part in the conspiracy, fled and went into hiding. However, he was betrayed by a friend in January 1945 and captured by the Gestapo. He was brought before the People's Court, presided over by the notorious Judge Roland Freisler, and sentenced to death on 2 March 1945. Hitler, enraged by the assassination attempt, ordered the conspirators to be executed in the most humiliating and painful manner possible. Nebe was hanged on 21 March 1945 with piano wire at Plötzensee prison in Berlin. The method of execution, which used a meat hook and a thin hemp rope, was designed to prolong the agony of the condemned. In some cases, death could take up to 20 minutes, making this method one of the most feared in war. After the war, some of the survivors of the 20th of July plot attempted to portray Nebe as a hero and a dedicated anti-Nazi. However, historians have debunked these claims, pointing out that Nebe was an opportunist and a mass murderer who actively participated in the crimes of the Nazi regime. His legacy is a grim reminder of the complicity of many German officials in the horrors of the Holocaust and World War II. Nebe was not a moral resistor, but rather a man who sought his own gain within the Nazi regime. His involvement in war crimes, from mass shootings to gas vans and public hangings, makes him an emblematic figure of the brutality of the Third Reich. His execution in 1945 marked the end of a career marked by violence and opportunism, but his legacy remains a reminder of the horrors of Nazism and the complicity of those who supported it. The death of Rudolf Höss. Hanging as a method of execution during World War II was not only a form of punishment, but also a symbol of terror and domination. Among the many names associated with this method, that of Rudolf Höss, commandant of the Auschwitz concentration camp, stands out for his central role in the Holocaust. Born in 1901 in Baden-Baden, Germany, to a Catholic family, Höss was raised in a deeply religious environment. His father, a strict and devout man, expected Rudolf to follow an ecclesiastical career. However, young Höss strayed from this path, developing a growing interest in military and political life. In 1916, following the death of his father, Höss enlisted in the same regiment where his father and grandfather had served. This act marked the beginning of a military career that would lead him to become one of the main executors of the genocidal policies of the Nazi regime. During the 1920s, Höss joined the Freikorps, a paramilitary organization that played a crucial role in the rise of Adolf Hitler. It was in this context that Höss began to show his willingness to extreme violence, participating in acts of brutality that foreshadowed his future role in the Holocaust. In 1923, Höss was involved in the murder of a local teacher, a crime for which he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, he served only 5 years before being released under a general amnesty. This period in prison only hardened his character and solidified his loyalty to the nationalist and anti-Semitic ideas that were beginning to gain traction in Germany. Following his release, Höss joined the Artemannsleague, an organization that promoted racial purity and agriculture as a way of life. It was here that he met Heinrich Himmler, who would later recruit him into the SS. In 1934, Höss joined the SS, the Nazi paramilitary organization, and quickly rose through the ranks. His first posting was the Dachau concentration camp, where he learned the techniques of control and extermination that he would later apply at Auschwitz. Höss proved to be an efficient and ruthless administrator, qualities that earned him his appointment as commandant of Auschwitz in 1940. Under his leadership, the camp was transformed into a mass extermination center, where millions of people, mainly Jews, were murdered in gas chambers. The Auschwitz concentration camp, under the command of Rudolf Höss, became the epicenter of the Holocaust. Höss was the first to implement the use of Zyklon B gas in the gas chambers, a method that allowed thousands of people to be murdered quickly and efficiently. The gas chambers, disguised as showers, were a death trap for prisoners who entered believing they were going to be disinfected. Instead of water, Zyklon B gas was released, killing victims within minutes. Höss not only oversaw the extermination process, he also perfected it. Under his direction, Auschwitz became a death factory, where every aspect of the process was carefully planned to maximize efficiency. Prisoners arriving at the camp were selected into two groups. Those who were able to work were sent to the labor camps, while the elderly, the sick, and children were sent directly to the gas chambers. Höss estimated that under his command, at least 2.5 million people were murdered in the gas chambers, while another 500,000 died of starvation and disease. Höss's efficiency in managing the camp was such that even the crematory ovens, designed to incinerate corpses, were operated 24 hours a day. The plumes of smoke rising from the crematoria were visible for miles around, a constant reminder of the horror unfolding within the camp. Höss not only oversaw the extermination, but also ensured that the bodies were disposed of quickly and discreetly, to avoid any trace of the atrocities committed. In addition to the gas chambers, Höss implemented other measures to ensure the efficiency of the camp. Prisoners were stripped of all their belongings, including clothing, jewelry, and documents, which were catalogued and sent to Germany for reuse. Even the hair of victims was cut off and used to make textiles. Höss also oversaw the construction of additional barracks to house more prisoners, as well as the expansion of the railroad tracks leading to Auschwitz, which allowed for the arrival of more trains loaded with victims. In 1944, Höss carried out one of the most brutal operations of the Holocaust, Operation Höss. This operation, which bore his name, involved the deportation of 450,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz, half of Hungary's Jewish population. During this period, the gas chambers were operating at full capacity, murdering around 10,000 people a day. The crematoria, which were already operating at their limits, could not handle the volume of corpses, leading to the implementation of mass shootings in mass graves. Operation Höss was a prime example of the efficiency and brutality of the Nazi regime. Not only did Höss oversee the deportation and extermination of hundreds of thousands of people, he also ensured that the process was as quick and discreet as possible. Prisoners were selected and sent to the gas chambers within hours, with no time to resist or escape. Höss, in his role as commander, was ruthless in his pursuit of efficiency, even when this meant increasing the pace of executions and extermination. As the war progressed and Allied forces closed in on Auschwitz, Höss began taking steps to conceal evidence of the atrocities committed at the camp. Despite his efforts, however, the Allies discovered the horrors of Auschwitz when they liberated the camp in 1945. The evidence found at the camp, including the crematoria and gas chambers, was enough to convict Höss and other Nazi officials of crimes against humanity. Following the liberation of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss managed to evade capture for some time by disguising himself in a German naval uniform. However, in March 1946, he was captured thanks to the betrayal of his wife, who confessed to his whereabouts under threat of losing her family. Höss was put on trial at the famous Nuremberg Trials, where he faced charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. During his trial, Höss admitted his role in the Holocaust, stating that under his command, at least 2.5 million people were murdered in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. He also acknowledged that another 500,000 people died of starvation and disease at the camp. Höss showed no remorse for his actions, and instead justified his actions as part of his duty as a soldier and member of the SS. His coldness and lack of remorse shocked even the judges and prosecutors, who described him as a man completely devoid of humanity. In November 1947, Rudolf Höss was sentenced to death by hanging. His execution took place at the Auschwitz concentration camp, the very place where he had overseen the extermination of millions of people. Höss walked to the scaffold with the same cold-bloodedness he had displayed during his trial, and his death marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in human history. Yet, his legacy of terror and brutality remains a reminder of the horrors of the Holocaust and of human capacity for extreme evil. Hanging Nazis. October 16, 1946, marked a milestone in the history of international justice. On that day, in the gymnasium of Landsberg prison in Nuremberg, The executions of some of the main officials of the German National Socialist regime took place. Among them was Julius Streicher, editor of the infamous newspaper Der Stürmer, known for its anti-Semitic propaganda and its role in spreading racist stereotypes that fueled hatred of Jews. Streicher, even in his final moments, displayed a defiant attitude, spitting and shouting "Heil Hitler" at Joseph Malta, the military policeman tasked with assisting in his execution. Joseph Malta, a young man of 28, became a key figure in these executions. Although he was not the main executioner, his participation was fundamental. Malta described years later, in an interview with the Italian newspaper La Repubblica, how he had to ensure that Streicher died quickly, since the hanging mechanism did not work as expected. This account, along with other testimonies, offers a raw and detailed insight into how these executions were carried out, which were not only intended to deliver justice, but also to send a strong message to the world about the consequences of crimes against humanity. The chief executioner at Nuremberg was John Clarence Woods, an American soldier who, according to accounts, volunteered for the job despite having no previous experience in executions. Woods, who claimed to have worked as an executioner in Oklahoma and Texas, proved inept at his job. His errors in calculating the length of the ropes resulted in several of the condemned not dying instantly from cervical fracture, but suffering prolonged agony from asphyxiation. This fact did not go unnoticed by those present, who described the scene as gruesome, although some interpreted it as a form of almost biblical justice after the horrors revealed during the trials. The Nuremberg executions were not only an act of justice, but also a media spectacle. Journalists such as Kingsbury Smith of the International News Service meticulously documented every detail, from the last words of the condemned to the reactions of those present. These accounts, published in media such as Life and Time, helped to build the historical narrative of these events, although they also generated controversy for their sensationalist approach. The figure of the executioner in World War II acquired a central role in the application of military justice. John Clarence Woods, although inept, was not the only one in charge of carrying out executions. Another prominent name was that of the British Thomas William Pierrepoint, who, unlike Woods, demonstrated remarkable precision and professionalism. Pierrepoint, a member of a family of executioners, carried out more than 200 executions in occupied Germany, including those of those responsible for the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Pierrepoint became famous for his efficiency and methodical approach. In the case of the Bergen-Belsen executions, he decided to separate men and women to prevent the latter from hearing the sounds of the executions before their turn. This gesture, described as chivalrous by some historians, contrasts with the brutality of the crimes for which the prisoners were convicted. Among them was Irma Grese, known as the Beast of Bergen-Belsen, whose cruelty towards prisoners was widely documented during her trial. Grese, like other condemned prisoners, faced her fate with a disturbing coldness, uttering only the word "Schnell," quick, before dying. While Pierrepoint represented British efficiency, Woods embodied American improvisation. His lack of experience and technical errors, such as incorrect use of ropes, led to criticism and controversy. However, Woods proudly defended his work, stating in an interview with the Star and Stripes newspaper that he had done a good job and had no regrets. His death in 1950, electrocuted while working in the Marshall Islands, added an aura of mystery to his figure, with rumors suggesting that he may have been killed by ex-Nazis. In addition to Woods and Pierrepoint, other lesser-known executioners also played a crucial role in post-war executions. Joseph Malta, although not the main executioner, became a symbolic figure due to his direct involvement in the Nuremberg executions. Malta, which claimed to have hanged 60 Nazis, kept as a trophy a miniature replica of the gallows used in the trials, an object it refused to sell despite financial offers, including one from actress Elizabeth Taylor. The Nuremberg executions were not only an act of justice, but also a moment of reflection on the legacy of National Socialism. Each of the condemned was given the opportunity to speak his last words, and these statements revealed a range of attitudes, from regret to obstinacy. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former German foreign minister, expressed his wish that Germany would become a united nation again and that the world would find peace. Wilhelm Keitel, for his part, showed more courage on the gallows than in court, where he had tried to justify his actions by arguing that he was just following orders. Julius Streicher, the editor of Der Stürmer, was perhaps the most defiant of all. Before he died, he cried out, "One day the Bolsheviks will hang you," a statement that reflected his ideology to the very end. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the leader of the SS in Austria, signed off with a laconic, "Good luck, Germany," while Hans Frank, the governor of occupied Poland, expressed gratitude for the treatment he had received during his captivity and asked for God's mercy. These final words, though diverse in tone and content, shared a common theme: concern for Germany's future. Many of the condemned expressed a desire for the country to recover from the devastation of war and find a path to peace. Yet their statements also revealed the persistence of the ideologies that had brought the world to the brink. The legacy of these men, and of the executions themselves, remains a matter of debate. For some, the executions represented an act of necessary justice, a symbolic closure to one of the darkest chapters in human history. For others, however, the executions raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and revenge. Were these executions an act of impartial justice, or a form of revenge for the horrors committed during the war? The Nuremberg executions not only had an immediate impact on survivors and witnesses, but also left a deep mark on culture. Images of the lifeless bodies of Nazi leaders, taken by Rex Morgan, the chief mortician for the US Army, became powerful symbols of the end of the Third Reich. These photographs, although initially censored in some countries, were widely circulated in the international press and used as historical evidence in the years that followed. The place where the executions took place, the Landsberg Prison Gymnasium, also took on symbolic significance. After the events of October 1946, the space returned to its original use as a basketball court for American soldiers, a surreal contrast to its previous role as a stage for Allied justice. This change in function reflects the complexity of the post-war period, where physical and symbolic spaces were transformed to adapt to a new reality. In the cultural realm, the Nuremberg executions inspired numerous literary, cinematic, and journalistic works. Books such as Andrew Nagorski's Nazi Hunters and documentaries such as Robert E. Connort's Justice at Nuremberg have helped to keep the memory of these events alive. However, criticism has also been raised about the sensationalist approach of some of these works, which often emphasize the technical errors of the executions rather than their broader historical significance. Finally, the Nuremberg executions raised fundamental questions about the nature of justice and individual responsibility. To what extent can individuals be held responsible for crimes committed under a totalitarian regime? Were the executions an act of justice or a form of revenge? These questions, while not having easy answers, remain relevant in the context of war crimes and international trials today.